TGI Fridays is one of those classic American restaurants. For multiple decades, they have been serving up loaded potato skins and mozzarella sticks and so many other signature menu items all across the United States and in many other countries around the world. In 1986, they opened their first international location in England, and ever since have expanded into dozens of other countries. Notably, about a decade later, they became the first American restaurant of its kind to open a location in Moscow, Russia. Given its rich history, longtime popularity, and influence, I would qualify it as an iconic chain that I'm sure has been the setting of a lot of fun memories for us. So it is upsetting to talk about the fact that TGI Fridays is not doing well. To be clear, this chain has been struggling for quite some time. Just as an example, here is a Chicago Tribune article from 2005 that starts by saying, "If you haven't thought about TGI Fridays in a while, you're not alone." For well over a decade now, there's been a trend of falling sales, as they have shut down underperforming locations to a point where, in the US, they are now about a quarter of the size that they used to be. Again, there is not much promise to be taken from any of that, but holy cow, over the past couple of years, it feels like TGI Fridays has been in complete panic mode, closing more restaurants than ever as they struggle to pay their bills. I just have this image in my head of the phone ringing with the bill collector on the other end, and TGI Fridays is over there searching through the couch cushions, trying to find whatever money they can to hold them over for a while. Alright, maybe that is exaggerating a little bit, but maybe not. In 2023, the company changed CEOs twice, along with some major menu changes. Then, all in 2024, they announced that they would be selling licensing rights to Kraft Heinz to pay off some of their debt. You know how they have those frozen appetizers and other TGI Fridays branded products at the grocery stores? Well, Kraft Heinz now has perpetual control over those. A few months later, they announced that they would be selling their company-owned restaurants to franchisees to raise more money to pay off debt, which is the exact opposite of what they were doing a few years earlier. It all gets a little complex in the details, but TGI Fridays lost control of their assets, an announced merger was called off, they closed an additional 50 restaurants, and have filed for bankruptcy. Those are just some of the highlights. So in this video, I want to try to answer the big question of what happened to TGI Fridays. And I put together a list of what I believe to be the 5 biggest reasons behind their decline. Starting off with singles bars. Now, hold on, I imagine a lot of people might be extremely confused at the moment, but it is going to make more sense when I tell you that TGI Fridays started out as a singles bar, and arguably it was the first one. In 1965, Alan Stillman worked as a perfume salesman in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where he would frequently go to a bar called Good Tavern. Like most of the other taverns at the time, that one had an almost exclusively male customer base, but Alan Stillman had kind of a genius vision for it. There happened to be a large population of females living in the area, specifically models and flight attendants, so he figured that if the bar had more of a friendly, vibrant atmosphere, it could be a cool place for both genders to hang out and meet each other. So he borrowed $5,000 from his mother, took over the building on a short-term lease, and transformed it. He cleaned it up, made it brighter, painted it, added a bunch of plants, and introduced those signature red and white stripes for the employees' uniforms. He had no experience in the industry and claims that he didn't really know what he was doing, but the plan worked perfectly. There were lines forming out the door, and imitators quickly started popping up. That success helped spark a whole trend that became known as singles bars, or fern bars, referring to those plants that were added. That original TGI Fridays became such a sensation that people in other parts of the country started contacting him about opening their own TGI Fridays. In 1970, after 5 years, he partnered with someone in Memphis to open the second location, and then 2 years later, a much larger one was opened in Dallas, Texas. However, by the middle of the 1970s, the culture was changing, and singles bars had become more of a dying fad, which obviously was a major issue for TGI Fridays, but I would say that they did a good job at reacting to it. Their response was to transition into something that looked much more promising: casual dining, a decision that, well, ultimately backfired because I have it on my list as the next reason behind their decline. In the 1970s, TGI Fridays stopped trying to attract singles in trendy urban areas in favor of attracting families in more traditional suburban areas. A big part of that plan was to expand the menu to offer more meals, and that is when they introduced their signature potato skins, which is probably the perfect symbol of their new identity. Also in that decade, TGI Fridays was sold a couple of times, ultimately being controlled by a large hospitality company called Carlson, where it remained for the next 40 years. Over that time, they grew it into a national brand with hundreds of locations throughout the country. The issue here is that casual dining was so promising that TGI Fridays was only one of many chains that were emerging during that time. Competitors like Applebee's and Chili's were becoming more popular, splitting the market share by attracting many of the same customers, and let's face it, with each new competitor added to the mix, it can become more difficult to stand out with your own identity. I mean, one of these competitors also had a day of the week in its name, so if you are deciding if you want to go to TGI Fridays or Ruby Tuesdays, I don't know, it just starts to blend together. But you know what? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when most of these casual dining restaurants were popping up, I think that TGI Fridays actually did a pretty good job in maintaining that own identity. And most of that can be explained by using one word that happens to be the next reason on my list: flair. I realize that anyone who has seen the movie Office Space probably has an idea of what I'm going to say here, but hear me out, it is a little more complex than you might be thinking. See, dating all the way back to the beginning, TGI Fridays has always had a lot of stylishness and originality, as the word is defined. Just think about how Alan Stillman was trying to attract women to the bar by making it more friendly and energetic, and well, I think that is the part that carried over the most when making the transition into casual dining. You could see it in the uniform, the colors, and of course all of that stuff that they were hanging on the wall. The movie Cocktail from the 1980s is mostly remembered by the way that the bartenders would spin and throw the bottles around while serving up the drinks. In other words, they were off the charts with flair, and a lot of it is influenced by what was going on at TGI Fridays. Part of the movie was filmed at that original location. Tom Cruise trained with a bartender from the company to learn how to do that stuff, and Alan Stillman even claims that the character was based on him. Still, to this day, TGI Fridays hosts a World Bartender Championship competition. They tried to make bartending an official Olympic sport, and they even hold a world record for the most people cocktail flaring. In short, I would argue that the main thing that made TGI Fridays stand out from all of the other casual dining restaurants was the flair. But then, I think flair stopped being cool. Honestly, well, not to offend anyone, it may have always been walking a fine line between lame and cool, but this kind of stuff was appealing to people. The movie Cocktail was among the top 10 highest grossing films of that year, despite receiving mostly negative reviews, and like it or not, the flair was a big part of the success of TGI Fridays. When Office Space came out in 1999, it famously made fun of the flair, kind of exposing the absurdity of it at that point, and expressing what a lot of the public was probably already thinking. Something that was once a positive had now become a negative, so I don't think Office Space was directly responsible, but a few years later, TGI Fridays spent an estimated $200 million to do a complete overhaul that essentially removed the flair from their image. I promise, I'm gonna stop saying the word flair, but they got rid of the stripes on the uniforms, the suspenders, made the walls less busy, altered the coloring a little bit, made menu changes, everything became much more toned down. In 2013, they even simplified the logo by changing the shape and getting rid of the punctuation. Throughout all of this, they were mostly praised for the changes because they did get rid of a lot of the stuff that was maybe annoying people, but they also lost part of their identity and started blending in with all of the other casual dining restaurants, much more than they were before anyway. So maybe you can respect the tricky situation that they were in there. The next reason on my list is going to be a fast one, but still very significant: fast casual. It is a relatively new restaurant category that falls between fast food and casual dining. I'm talking about restaurants like Chipotle or Panda Express that have exploded in popularity over the past few decades, pulling customers away from the more traditional casual dining concepts like TGI Fridays. I have talked about this on the channel multiple times before and even listed it as a reason behind the decline of other similar restaurants. So when they were already splitting the market between each other, and then all of these new concepts come in to split things even further, further, well, obviously that is going to be bad news. Moving on to the final reason on my list, I'm going to just call it external factors. Inflation, operational costs, interest rates. Whenever a company is in such an unstable condition like this, even a small external issue can amplify into having a large impact. Take a look at the recession. It was not good for most of the industry because people had less money to spend on going out to eat at restaurants, but TGI Fridays was so impacted by it that they failed to ever fully recover. In 2008, right as it was happening, they reached their peak of 600 US locations, and that has been steadily declining ever since. In 2014, it was sold after almost 4 decades in an $800 million deal. The pandemic is another obvious external factor that hurt the company, probably far more than it should have. Just looking back at that graph from before, we can see that sales took, well, an understandable dip in 2020 while the restaurants were closed or people were apprehensive about eating outside of their home, but those numbers have not even come close to returning to those previous levels. And to add yet another layer on top of it, the company was in the middle of this big merger that would have turned them into a public company. It could have changed the course for them in different ways, but it was essentially called off due to the pandemic. Again, I am not saying that these external factors are the core of the issue here, but they have complicated an already tricky situation. To summarize, the way I see the situation is that TGI Fridays is an old brand that simply was not meant to last on a large scale forever. In fact, we have seen that a lot of smart decisions had to be made for it to last as long as it has. Evolving and adapting is a huge part of long-time business success, and honestly, I would say that TGI Fridays has done a decent job at that over the years. Doesn't it seem like everything that made them successful eventually turned into their failures? Singles bars, casual dining, flair, which make up the majority of my list, all started out as great ideas that either grew old or started to be replaced. Clearly, TGI Fridays has not done everything perfect, but at the same time, I'll admit that I could see myself making a lot of those same decisions that have led them into this corner in which they are currently trapped. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about TGI Fridays? Was it better in the past? Has it always been good? Or maybe you think it has never been good? Statistically speaking, the one closest to you has probably shut down over the past few years, if not within the past few months. So I'm curious to hear how you feel about that. And also, where do you think they went wrong? What I mean is, what should they have done differently to avoid all of this trouble? And finally, what do you see for the future? Are they going to turn things around or continue along the same path, existing on a smaller and smaller scale each year? And any other thoughts you have about TGI Fridays or anything else in this video, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.